Teresa Mangum belonged to a prominent Pike County family.
Her dad was the county commission chairman.
Buzz Burousas had an equally distinguished pedigree.
Mr. Burousas was the son of a retired judge.
And when they married, friends and family were happy, almost as happy as Buzz.
Buzzy loved his wife more than any man that I've ever known.
But he wouldn't love her long.
It was kind of like pow, pow, pow.
Inside the vehicle, I saw Buzz with an apparent gunshot wound to his head.
Now go inside the investigation.
I thought they were going to kill me.
As they uncover some shocking accusations.
He was a monster behind closed doors.
Wanted more of a very different sexual lifestyle.
Disturbing secrets that supposedly drove Teresa to desperate measures.
The last thing he saw was her pointing that pistol.
Pike County, Georgia, July 1st, 2009. It was a lazy summer afternoon in this peaceful rural community an hour south of Atlanta.
The pace of life in Pike County is pretty slow. People here tend to stop and enjoy life.
It's a type of community, almost like Mayberry on the Andy Griffith Show.
In fact, the community is such a throwback to an older time that when one Pike County resident dialed 911 at 4:30 on that Wednesday afternoon, he started out by introducing himself by name.
This is Doug Mangum.
Most people that live in the community know one another.
Not only that, chances are they know who they're related to and even descended from.
The Mangums are a good, old, well-respected family around here.
And Doug Mangum was even more respected than most.
He was the county commission chairman.
However, the county commissioner wasn't calling for himself. He told the dispatcher that his daughter, 46-year-old Teresa Burousas, had called him moments earlier in a panic.
Two men have attacked her and her husband.
Miss Burousas told him that she had been assaulted and robbed and that she needed help.
Can you get ambulance in the law over there?
Sheriff's deputies rushed to the remote country home that Teresa shared with her husband, 61-year-old Buzz Burousas.
The house is at the top of a hill. It's probably a quarter-mile long drive, if not more.
Although when the deputies arrived, they found Buzz's car parked at the bottom of the drive.
The driver's door was open.
Inside the vehicle, I saw Buzz with an apparent gunshot wound to his head.
He was obviously deceased.
And Teresa, whose call had brought deputies to the scene, she was nowhere in sight, leaving the authorities wondering, where was she, and was she still in danger? Born in 1962, Teresa Mangum came from a family with deep roots in rural Pike County.
My granddaddy was F.E. Mangum. His people came into the county around 18 teens to the early 20s and been here ever since.
But while the entire extended family's bonds were tight, no one was closer than Teresa and her father, a longtime Pike County commissioner.
Her and Doug had a very unique relationship, a very close relationship. He was a devoted, faithful, 100% loving father.
And due to her father's doting, Teresa grew up more than a little bit sheltered.
Everyone in the community described Teresa as a very quiet, shy person.
She spent a lot of her time caring for her dog. She was an avid animal person.
One that never strayed far from home.
Teresa never spent much time outside of Pike County.
And when she graduated high school in 1980, she didn't exactly go off to college either. Instead, she commuted to the Gordon Junior College just across the county line in Barnesville.
Just a small college town.
And it was while at Gordon working on her associate's degree that Teresa first met Buzz. 14 years older than Teresa, Buzz was also from a prominent local family.
Mr. Burousas was the son of a retired judge.
And much like Teresa, Buzz also preferred the quiet life.
Buzz was a bit of an introvert and that he liked to keep to himself.
So despite the family's prominence, after high school, Buzz declined to pursue a career in the law or politics and spent the next several years living with mom and dad, attending college off and on, and dabbling in a wide variety of interests.
Cars, motorcycles, and he got into computers and electronics. And Buzzy quit school, and then he went back.
Which is what eventually brought him to Gordon Junior College in 1981.
He was an intelligent guy. He got his associate's degree from Gordon.
But an associate's degree wasn't all he came away with.
He told me, he said, I met this girl.
And despite the 14-year difference between him and 19-year-old Teresa,
he talked about how much he liked her and everything.
The pair had a lot in common, a shared love of animals and family.
They both lived with their respective parents.
And when Buzz finally asked her out, Teresa said yes.
They started dating in 1981.
He would take her out, whatever she wanted to do.
And it was immediately clear to Buzz's friends that he was in love.
He just couldn't get her out of his head.
And Buzz, already in his 30s, was ready for a serious commitment.
He wanted to be married to Teresa.
But when he proposed,
she said she just wasn't ready.
Not ready to be married, and according to Teresa, not ready to leave her parents, despite being in her early 20s.
Her parents, she didn't know how they'd take it and all of that.
So the couple continued to go out together.
They dated every Friday night.
For the next 25 years.
Whatever makes Teresa happy, that's what he wanted. He was convinced she was the best thing in the world.
And he was convinced that someday she would be his.
He always held out hope that they were going to get married.
And he didn't stop trying either.
Buzz had proposed multiple times.
But Teresa's answer was always the same.
She said she wasn't ready. I thought she was going to use that excuse for the rest of his life.
After years of Teresa's refusals, friends repeatedly urged Buzz to move on, to find someone who did want a commitment. But he would have none of it.
When it come to Teresa, he just lost all his brains.
So for 2 decades, they continued their weekly dates while Teresa lived at home.
She would be always in church on Sunday, always with her dad.
She also held down a series of jobs.
She worked for State Farm Insurance. She was a secretary for me and answered the phone and things.
Buzz, meanwhile, got a steady job at the local Caterpillar factory.
They make heavy equipment and components for heavy equipment.
He was a devoted worker.
He was making a good salary.
And most of it he saved up for the future.
He was very frugal, watched his money and put it in the bank.
But would that future be with Teresa? In 2005, something happened that would end decades of hesitation on her part.
Her mother became sick with cancer.
And when Teresa's mother said that she wanted to see her daughter married before she died, Teresa finally said yes.
That's when she agreed to marry Buzz.
And on January 7th, 2006, while her ailing mother looked on, 43-year-old Teresa walked down the aisle and married Buzz.
It was a private ceremony. Teresa didn't want anybody there but family.
After more than 20 years of waiting, Buzz was ecstatic.
Buzzy loved his wife more than any man that I've ever known loved their wife.
Teresa's mother passed away a few months after the wedding. And a few months after that, Teresa and Buzz began building their dream home in northwest Pike County.
This is a very rural area. It's not a high-traffic area.
A lot of family property, a lot of old farms.
Once settled in, the couple was soon busy raising a house full of dogs.
They had about 6 or 7 dogs.
They treated the dogs just like they were children, like they were human beings.
And while Teresa was a stay-at-home mother for their furry children,
she would cook the animals T-bone steaks for dinner.
Buzz continued to work at Caterpillar.
They was fixing to make him a foreman.
Although every day at 3:30, he hurried home to be with the bride he'd waited so long to marry.
He usually called home prior to leaving work to let Teresa know that he was on his way.
And even after 3 years of marriage, he was still calling ahead to let Teresa know he was coming home. Although on the afternoon of July 1st, 2009, he would get no farther than the bottom of the driveway. Coming up, the authorities find Teresa bloody and battered.
EMS personnel made a decision to life flight Teresa.
But she lives to tell a harrowing tale.
All of a sudden, there was something around my neck, and I just couldn't breathe.
On July 1st, 2009, deputies from the Pike County, Georgia Sheriff's Department rushed to the remote rural home of 46-year-old Teresa Burousas and her husband, Buzz.
When we were dispatched, the only information we were given over the 911 radio was robbery and assault.
The 911 call had come from Teresa's father, Doug Mangum, a former county commissioner.
She called her dad looking for help.
Do you know how bad that hurt or anything? No, she was crying when she called me.
When the deputies arrived at the scene, they found Buzz sitting in his car at the bottom of the drive.
He was sitting in the driver's seat, kind of slumped over onto the steering wheel.
He was obviously deceased at the scene.
He had 2 apparent bullet wounds in his body, one in the left side of his chest and one to the left side of the head.
There was no sign of Teresa, though.
Couldn't really see the house from the roadway.
We had no idea what to expect.
And as the deputies cautiously made their way up the drive.
We saw Teresa laying in the yard.
But unlike Buzz, she was alive.
She was waving her arms, asking for help.
You could see some marks on the face and blood.
Asked her what had happened. She said she'd been assaulted by 2 males, one black, one white.
She was screaming that she had been struck with a hammer.
Fearing a traumatic brain injury, the EMTs at the scene knew they had to act fast.
EMS personnel had made a decision to life flight Teresa to Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta.
We don't have any trauma centers. If you have a severe head injury, you're flying.
And while the EMTs prepared for the chopper to arrive, the deputies approached the house.
We didn't know if there might be the suspect still inside the residence.
But the house was empty of people, that is.
There were stacks of newspapers and boxes.
There was a lot of things still in the box, still new things that had never been opened.
You basically had a pathway that you had to walk through to get into the bedroom.
Outside, near where Teresa lay, the investigators did find a few clues.
They'd found a rope and they'd found a hammer.
But there was no sign of a gun.
The murder weapon was not at the scene.
A weapon the investigators suspected was a revolver.
There were no shell casings recovered from the scene.
But who had wielded the gun? When the investigators canvassed a handful of houses in the area, one of Teresa and Buzz's neighbors gave them what appeared to be a promising lead.
They'd seen a white Trans Am in the area leaving at a high rate of speed.
Not only had the suspicious vehicle fled at around 4:30 p.m., approximately the same time Teresa's father had called 911.
It appeared to have been occupied by a white male and a black male.
An apparent getaway vehicle and 2 men that matched Teresa's description of her assailants. The sheriff's department immediately set up roadblocks all across the county in hopes of apprehending the killers.
There was a lookout put out for the Trans Am and the black male and the white male.
Meanwhile, word of the murder quickly made its way around the tight-knit rural community.
The word is out and everyone in the town knows about what's going on.
I was devastated. A nice guy like that sure didn't deserve what he got.
And to make sure his killers got what they deserved, pretty soon all of Pike County was on the lookout for that elusive white Trans Am.
As a community, you pull together and you want to be vigilant and you want to see justice served.
But was the community looking in the wrong place? That evening, while law enforcement scoured Pike County for any sign of the suspects or their white Trans Am, Teresa was already on her way home from the hospital in Atlanta.
The only injuries that they could find on her were 2 superficial scratches on her forehead.
And despite the fact that she'd been airlifted to Grady Memorial, one of the top trauma centers in the Southeast.
Grady Memorial treated her with a Band-Aid and 2 regular strength Tylenol.
Needless to say, the investigators were stunned to learn that their one surviving victim had already been released from the hospital.
How could that be if she was struck with a hammer?
Doesn't have a concussion or cracked skull or anything.
That there was a major red flag for law enforcement.
So much so that they asked Teresa to come in for a formal statement.
The day after the murder had occurred, we had our initial interview with Teresa at the sheriff's office.
She didn't bring an attorney, but she did bring her father, Doug Mangum, a former Pike County commissioner.
Her father was very supportive.
He thought he should be in the room with her.
Although, since he wasn't his daughter's attorney,
they wouldn't let him in the room.
Once alone in the interview room with the investigators, Teresa told them that the day of the murder had started out the same as any other. She had taken care of her dogs and run a few errands in town, while Buzz went to work.
It's always kind of the same old schedule every day.
But that afternoon, when she got back to the house, Teresa said one of their dogs had been behaving strangely.
He's growling and just real aggressive, and I think he was trying to let me know that something was wrong.
But Teresa said that she had ignored the dog's warning.
I dragged him back to his crate and I put him in there.
But according to Teresa, the dog was still growling, clearly upset about something, when Buzz called her at around 3:30 that afternoon.
Mr. Burousas told her that he was on his way home, and for her to put something nice on, he wanted to go out to dinner.
Teresa told the investigators that she had gotten ready, and then at around 4:15 gone outside into the yard, expecting Buzz to pull into the drive at any moment. And that's when she heard it.
It was kind of like pow, pow, pow.
Although the gunshots sounded close, Teresa said she hadn't given them much thought. It was rural Georgia, after all.
We hear them real regular, and especially on the weekends.
But then, moments later, as she was bending over some flowers in the yard,
all of a sudden, there was something around my neck, and I just couldn't breathe.
She indicated that a rope was placed around her neck.
Teresa said her attackers, a black male and a white male, were both wearing ski masks and demanded money.
It was the black man that says, we know you probably have more money in the house, and you're going to tell us where it is.
She replied to him that she didn't know anything about any money.
And according to Teresa, that's when the hammer had come into play.
The white male hits her with the hammer, asks her again where the money's at. She replies that she does not know.
And every time she said she didn't know, Teresa claimed the hammer had swung again.
He was whacking me really hard across here.
Worse, she said they told her Buzz wouldn't be able to save her.
At this point in time, the black male tells her that they've already taken care of Buzz.
I was kind of really crying, and I was shaking. I was real scared, and I passed out.
However, before she passed out, Teresa said she had managed to learn 2 things. One was that the attack wasn't a random robbery.
The black guy called me by name.
And based on another thing her attackers said, Teresa believed that Buzz had somehow gotten mixed up with the wrong people.
He had shown interest in wanting to help them, like I said, with their meth lab.
Coming up, the investigators uncover some strange things about Buzz and Teresa's marriage.
It wasn't what he thought it was going to be.
And her father makes a fateful discovery.
He handed us a revolver, a .38 revolver.
On July 2nd, 2009, 46-year-old Teresa Burousas was in the middle of an interview at the Pike County, Georgia Sheriff's Department. The day before, Teresa's husband, Buzz, had been killed in what she described as a brutal home invasion.
Teresa's story was that they come to rob the house, hit her over the head, and then when Buzzy come home, they shot him at the gate.
However, according to what she just told the investigators, the murder wasn't a random crime.
She gave the story that Buzz had got into a methamphetamine drug ring.
They told me that Buzz had agreed to go into business with them.
Buzz owed them some money and they were going to collect.
That's what Teresa claimed, but the investigators weren't so sure. The 60-year-old factory worker made an unlikely drug kingpin.
How do you know these people?
Look at that's right.
You see what I'm saying? How does he know these people? Where do these people come from?
Teresa didn't really have an answer for that, or the next question the investigators asked.
I mean, there's a lot of big questions. Why harm Buzz?
And not kill you.
The story is just kind of far-fetched.
Although if Teresa was telling the truth, they may have meant to kill her.
She had claimed that she had been hit in the head with a hammer.
The blood, I just feel it running down my face,
But once again, the investigators were skeptical.
Your wounds don't tell the same story that your mouth tells, if you will. You understand?
And when they told her that, the result was a noticeable change in the interview.
She went into a different mode, shut down on us, and just quit answering questions.
I understand that you say that things are vague and you can't remember. Regardless of what happened, the truth will come out.
Right.
Not that the veiled threat had much effect on Teresa or her story.
I want y'all to know, everything that I can think of.
And she stuck by her story the next day, too, when the investigators took her back out to the crime scene.
I didn't even hear anything.
Okay.
And that's when I reached up around my neck. And
And it went from here to where'd you end up next in the yard?
We would have her walk us through step by step where she was at and where the supposed assailants came from.
I roll over, and that's when he started hitting me in my lower left leg.
So you roll over face down?
I roll over. Well, I was face down coming to, and then when he was hitting me this, and he's trying to make me stand back up, and I'm having a little trouble, that's when I roll over. Like, I would be this way when I roll over. And then he comes around and he started hitting me in my left leg.
During the entire reenactment, there was absolutely no emotions in her words or her face or anything. It was just very stoic.
And I started begging him. I started sobbing. I told him if he was going to shoot me, please don't shoot me in the gut. Just shoot me in the head, because I thought they were going to kill me.
Although by then, the investigators were even more doubtful that Buzz's mysterious drug dealer associates ever existed.
That he dealt with anybody that dealt in drugs was not substantiated by any evidence in the investigation.
Not when the investigators questioned his friends.
I know him. He didn't fool with no drugs.
Nor when they pulled his cell phone records.
He was being supposedly implicated in this methamphetamine ring, which normally entails a large amount of phone calls and or text messages. What was interesting on Buzz's cell phone was the lack of use on it. His phone was hardly, if ever, used, and if it was used, it was mainly used to call home to talk to Teresa.
However, there was one wild card still in play. Neighbors had reported seeing a white Trans Am and two men that fit Teresa's description of the attackers fleeing the scene.
So this kind of lended a little bit of credit to her attack story.
So just in case,
we start searching people that have white Trans Ams registered to their name within a 4-county area.
And they were still searching through vehicle registrations when Teresa's father contacted the investigators a few days later.
Mr. Mangum stated that we needed to come out to the residence where Mr. Burousas was killed.
And when the investigators drove out to the rural property where the murder occurred, they found Teresa's father, a former county commissioner, waiting anxiously on the porch.
He took us inside and handed us a revolver, a .38 revolver.
Was it the murder weapon? Not only did the lack of shell casings at the scene suggest a revolver, the autopsy of Buzz's body had recovered one of the slugs, too.
Turned out that he was shot with a .38 special.
Hoping to confirm that the .38 was the murder weapon, the investigators sent it off to the crime lab for ballistics testing. But not before Teresa's father made one final admission.
The The gun that was recovered belonged to Teresa.
It was a weapon that he had given her several years prior to her and Buzz getting married.
Whether her father fully understood the implications of that was hard to say.
I believe at this point, Mr. Mangum was still believing that we were looking for a white male and a black male that had assaulted his daughter and killed his son-in-law.
But once the investigators realized that Teresa owned a gun the same caliber as the one that killed Buzz, they were all but convinced the white Trans Am was nothing but a coincidence.
We're not looking for a white male and a black male. You know, we pretty much have our murderer.
But why would Teresa want her husband dead? When the investigators turned to Buzz's friends, they got a surprising answer. According to them, Teresa never wanted a husband, period.
I don't think she ever really wanted to get married.
According to Buzz's friends, Teresa would have been perfectly happy to live with her parents for the rest of her life.
She was a spoiled child. Whatever she wanted, she got.
But then, when Teresa's elderly mother was on her deathbed,
her mother's basically dying wish was for her daughter to be married.
I think that she pressured Teresa into marrying Buzz.
Told her she's getting older, it's time to get married.
So after years of saying she wasn't ready, Teresa had finally said, "I do."
It really surprised me when they did get married.
Although according to his friends, Buzz would soon be even more surprised.
When he was married to Teresa, I think he found out that it wasn't what he thought it was going to be.
He slept in one room of the house and she slept in the other.
Numerous people describe their marriage as a marriage of convenience.
One that Buzz apparently put up with.
When it comes to Teresa, it was whatever Teresa wants, that's what he's going to do.
And according to friends, what Teresa primarily wanted to do was shop.
She was into collectibles and had been termed a hoarder,
which explained the mess that the investigators had initially found inside the house.
All of her stuff was stacked up waist deep throughout the house.
And since Teresa didn't work,
she had a difficult time in keeping a job.
It had fallen to Buzz to support her habit.
Buzz was having to pay off credit cards and various debts, basically supporting her habit of buying whatever she wanted to buy.
And when the investigators pulled the couple's bank records, they realized that Buzz was having a hard time keeping up with Teresa's spending.
Buzz had been drawing out of his retirement accounts on a regular basis.
They were living beyond their means.
According to what Buzz told his friend Jimmy Green, the financial strain had eventually taken a toll on the couple's marriage.
He said, they fussed a lot, and he said Teresa just had these tantrums.
Did one of those tantrums end in Buzz's death? At the end of July, the ballistics results came back on Teresa's .38 revolver.
It was, in fact, the murder weapon.
The ballistics match on the gun was kind of the final nail for us, and it was time to arrest Teresa.
However, out of respect for her father, the deputies didn't cuff her and haul her into custody. Instead, on July 31st, they contacted the former county commission chairman and told him they had a warrant for his daughter's arrest.
Her father brought her up to the sheriff's office. She turned herself in.
Coming up, Teresa's prominent family causes problems for the prosecution.
4 judges recused themselves from this case.
And the defense makes some disturbing claims about Buzz.
He was a monster behind closed doors.
On October 3rd, 2011, Teresa Burousas stood trial for murder at the Pike County Courthouse in tiny Zebulon, Georgia. The 48-year-old was accused of killing her husband, Buzz Burousas, in July of 2009.
He thought he was going home and go to dinner, and he ended up dead in his driveway.
And since Teresa was the daughter of a prominent local family,
Teresa Burousas' father was the chairman of the Pike County Commission.
The murder had been the hottest gossip in Pike County for the past 2 years.
There were rumors flying everywhere. Some of them were downright slanderous, libelous. I mean, crazy, just crazy stuff.
Although one of the most startling developments in the case wasn't just talk. Barely a week after Teresa's arrest, the home she had shared with Buzz had mysteriously burned down.
It was totally destroyed. The fire gutted the house.
They never determined who done it, but it was definitely an arson.
And the news that it was arson sparked even more gossip.
The speculation was that the dad burned it down to conceal evidence.
Teresa's father was never charged, and publicly he never gave any indication that he doubted his daughter's innocence.
What I found strange was his unwillingness to believe that she may have committed this crime.
The fact that he was such a prominent local politician did cause plenty of chaos when it came to prosecuting his daughter, though.
We have 4 Superior Court judges. Those 4 judges recused themselves from this case.
They all knew Doug Mangum. He's in the courthouse every day, just like they were.
And finding a judge was especially important in Teresa's case, since she waived the right to a jury trial.
Everybody in the community had already made up their minds about this case. They had already decided one way or another.
Instead, when the trial got underway that Monday morning, it was what's known as a bench trial.
There's no jury involved. The 2 sides plead their case or present their case in front of a single judge.
One that had been brought in from Coweta County, roughly an hour away.
Someone that doesn't live in Pike County, who's not from Pike County and doesn't listen and read the newspapers in Pike County every day.
And it would be up to him to decide whether or not Teresa deserved life in prison for first-degree murder, as the prosecutor argued in his opening statement.
Our position was that this was clear-cut, this was a planned murder, and that all evidence pointed towards Teresa being the perpetrator.
As far as why Teresa would murder Buzz, the prosecution claimed it all began with her unhappy marriage.
Numerous people described their marriage as a marriage of convenience. There was very little physical contact between the 2.
They slept in separate bedrooms. It appeared to be married in name only.
And since it was a marriage of convenience, the prosecutors claimed that Teresa had no qualms about ending it.
She just didn't want to be married anymore, and instead of filing for a divorce, she decided to kill him.
Plus, as the prosecution pointed out, killing him rather than divorcing him would leave Teresa in possession of Buzz's retirement savings.
It was always our theory that money was involved.
She wanted to end up with the finances.
Whatever Teresa's motive, the prosecution had some pretty strong evidence that she had murdered Buzz. Most of all, that it was her gun that killed him.
The ballistics confirmed that the firearm that Mr. Mangum had located inside the residence was, in fact, a murder weapon.
Which meant that when it was the defense's turn, Teresa's attorney faced a tough battle.
All circumstances pointed towards Teresa Burousas as being the perpetrator of the crime.
But when they opened their case, the defense did something that caught the courtroom by surprise.
They basically admitted that she shot him.
According to the defense, when Buzz came home on the afternoon of July 1st, 2009, he'd found Teresa waiting at the bottom of the couple's driveway.
He kept the same routine every day. She knew what time he would be coming home and how he would be traveling.
And when he pulled into the drive,
Teresa walked up to the car and she said, "I got you a surprise." She told him to close his eyes.
Then, once his eyes were closed,
she pulled out a firearm and fired twice.
It was a shocking admission, one that basically confirmed everything the prosecution claimed.
She ambushed her husband.
But the real surprise came when the defense explained why she had supposedly done it.
Buzz had abused her.
According to the defense, Buzz may have appeared to be a hard-working, good-hearted man.
We actually didn't find one person that spoke badly of Buzz.
But the defense argued that behind closed doors, Buzz was something else entirely.
Buzz was into more of, I don't know how to put it, other than very different sexual lifestyle.
Extremely different, according to the defense.
He would want to sniff her butt rather than have any type sex.
In fact, The defense claimed that despite a relationship that spanned more than 20 years, Buzz and Teresa had never had sex.
Although they'd been married and together for a couple of decades, they had never consummated the marriage.
According to the defense, that was the main reason she had refused to marry Buzz for so long.
She wanted more of what you would consider a conventional sexual life.
However, the defense claimed it wasn't the only reason.
He drank quite a bit, and that was something that bothered her.
And according to the defense, when Teresa gave in to her parents' pressure and finally agreed to the marriage, life with Buzz was far worse than she had imagined it would be.
The defense attorney said that behind closed doors, when he would drink, he would become physically and mentally violent.
Everything from verbal abuse to physical abuse to slapping to hitting to basically calling her fat, stupid, dumb, ugly.
Cussing at her, yelling and screaming at her constantly.
Out in the courtroom, Buzz's friends and family were outraged by the accusation.
I knew right then that's a lie. He wouldn't lay a hand on her.
Everybody I talked to said they just couldn't believe that.
Family and friends, they all painted a picture of him as being a mild, meek, recluse, so to speak.
Which was true, according to the defense, but only on the outside.
The picture Miss Burousas was trying to paint for us was that he was a monster behind closed doors.
And I guess Teresa would be the only one living that would know.
And according to the defense, after only a few months of marriage,
she wanted out of a marriage.
But when Teresa called her father and begged to come home,
Mr. Mangum said, hey, well, you're his wife. You do what you're told to do. You stay married and you stick it out.
Trapped in an abusive marriage and abandoned by her father, the defense said that Teresa had become desperate.
She had no choice other than to protect herself.
And according to the defense, she had done just that on the afternoon of July 1st, 2009.
She ultimately snapped.
That was the defense, that she had been battered by Mr. Burousas throughout their marriage and had suffered numerous attacks by him and had finally gotten fed up and chose to take his life rather than continue to be beaten.
She decided to not let herself become the victim anymore.
However, there was one potentially big problem with the defense's claims.
There were never any law enforcement reports made by Miss Burousas. There was never any evidence to corroborate battered wife syndrome other than the self-serving statements of Miss Burousas.
Not that Teresa would make those statements to the judge herself. The defense wrapped up its case without putting her on the stand.
The evidence that they gave was mainly through psychological reports and a psychiatrist that took the stand.
And in the psychiatrist's opinion, Teresa's case was a textbook example of battered spouse syndrome.
She testified that, in her opinion, that Miss Burousas felt like she became trapped in a relationship where she was the victim of abuse and acted under the coercion or duress of battered women syndrome, not under the intent to kill.
That was the psychiatrist's opinion, but in the end, it was only the judge's opinion that mattered. Coming up, the judge struggles to make a decision.
I watched him and Hall.
And Buzz's friends struggle to accept it.
It's a joke as far as I'm concerned.
On October 4th, 2011, the Pike County Courthouse in Zebulon, Georgia was packed with people awaiting the judge's decision in the murder trial of Teresa Burousas. The 48-year-old daughter of a longtime county commissioner had admitted to killing her husband Buzz in July of 2009.
The last thing he saw was her pointing that pistol at him.
However, according to the defense, she'd only done it because of Buzz's abuse.
This was a person who really, in her mind, had become the victim of battered women syndrome.
It was a claim that Buzz's friends and family found hard to believe.
I think everybody thought it was preposterous.
But would the judge think so? Everything came down to his decision.
She had what is called a bench trial, which is a trial in which the judge determines the guilt or innocence of the accused.
And it appeared to be a tough call.
I watched him and Hall before he made his ultimate decision.
Although in the end, he found Teresa guilty, but not of murder.
He found her guilty of the lesser included offense of voluntary manslaughter.
The defense got basically the best they could hope for.
Our ace in the hole was an expert witness. We were able to show that battered women's syndrome played a part in this crime and that it was, in fact, not felony murder.
And then, after finding Teresa guilty of manslaughter, he sentenced her to 10 years in prison and 10 years probation with credit for time served.
Judge Baldwin basically gave her a chance at life again.
It's a chance that Teresa's family hopes she will take.
I've seen a lot of people that you form a bad opinion of, and then year down the road you see them and they reform, doing good things.
But while Teresa's family rejoiced, Buzz's family and friends were outraged.
She'll be younger when she gets out of prison than Buzzy was when she killed him. It's a joke as far as I'm concerned.
It was a bitter disappointment for the investigators and prosecutors, too.
You feel grief for the family of the victim. It was a senseless death.
And they remained convinced that it was nothing short of cold-blooded murder.
A very small amount of justice was served with her sentence.
And when Teresa is eventually released, she may find many of her neighbors in this small Georgia community still feel that way.
There were a handful of people that felt that she should have been freed completely. But the vast majority of the comments and the conversation around town, particularly in Lamar County, was she got away with murder.
In the early 1970s, Northern California was a place where freedom often looked deceptively simple. Young people traveled with backpacks slung over their shoulders. College students crossed counties with only a few dollars in their pockets. And hitchhiking was considered an ordinary part of everyday life. Standing beside the shoulder of Highway 101 with a thumb extended toward passing traffic did not immediately signal danger. It was simply how many teenagers returned home after school, how travelers continued their journeys, and how strangers briefly crossed paths before disappearing into one another's memories. Parents worried, of course, but the culture of the era was built on a quiet belief that most people could still be trusted. Every passing car carried possibility. Most rides lasted only a few miles. Most drivers expected nothing more than a brief conversation before dropping off their passenger. It was a world connected by highways and sustained by assumptions that would eventually prove devastatingly fragile. Sonoma County, with Santa Rosa at its center, reflected that optimism. Vineyards stretched across rolling hills. Small towns rested between forests and winding creeks. And country roads disappeared into valleys where silence settled quickly after sunset. The landscape seemed peaceful, almost idyllic. Yet beneath that peaceful surface, an invisible pattern was beginning to form. One disappearance could be explained away as a runaway teenager. A second might be blamed on youthful recklessness. A third could still be viewed as tragic coincidence. But eventually coincidence becomes impossible to ignore. Somewhere along the roads surrounding Santa Rosa, someone was watching. Someone understood the routines of young women who relied upon strangers for transportation. Someone knew how quickly an ordinary ride could become a final journey. Between 1972 and 1973, a series of murders unfolded that would become one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. At least 7 young women and girls would lose their lives. Others who vanished during the same period would later prompt investigators to ask whether the known. Victims represented only part of a much larger story. More than half a century has passed since those crimes. Advances in forensic science have transformed countless cold cases into solved investigations. Murderers once believed untouchable have been identified decades later through DNA, genealogy, and preserved evidence. Yet the Santa Rosa, a hitchhiker murders remain unresolved. No one has ever been convicted. No confirmed suspect has ever stood trial. The identity of the killer remains hidden behind decades of unanswered questions. What makes this case particularly unsettling is not merely the number of victims, but the remarkable absence of certainty. Investigators were never able to identify the true murder scene in any of the confirmed cases. The locations where bodies were discovered appeared to be dumping sites rather than the places where the crimes had actually occurred. That distinction mattered enormously. Without the original crime scene, detectives lost the opportunity to recover countless pieces of physical evidence that might have revealed the killer's identity. By the time several victims were discovered, exposure to weather and the passage of time had erased much of what remained. Some bodies had decomposed so extensively that medical examiners could no longer determine the precise cause of death. Other crucial questions, including whether sexual assault had occurred, simply could not be answered with certainty. It was as though the killer understood exactly how time, distance, and nature could work together to conceal the truth. Looking back today, it is tempting to imagine warning signs that should have been obvious. But history rarely unfolds with such clarity. Each family experienced its own private nightmare. Each disappearance initially belonged to a different investigation. Different detectives handled different reports. Different communities mourned different victims. No one immediately recognized that these tragedies shared common threads. It took months before investigators began noticing striking similarities. The victims were all young females, ranging in age from only 12 years old to 23. Many were known to hitchhike. Their bodies were recovered in isolated locations near creeks, ravines, or remote rural roads. Clothing was frequently missing or partially missing. Very little forensic evidence remained. The pattern was unmistakable once it finally emerged. But by then, precious time had already been lost. The murders also reflected a painful collision between an era of trust and a predator willing to exploit it. Hitchhiking itself was never the crime. Thousands of young people accepted rides every day without incident. Yet for one individual, that common social practice became an opportunity. Investigators would eventually believe that the offender deliberately selected young women who were alone and dependent upon the kindness of strangers. Rather than using force in public view, the killer likely relied first on conversation, persuasion, and the ordinary appearance of offering help. A driver stopping beside the road attracted little attention. A passenger climbing into a vehicle raised few suspicions. By the time anyone realized something had gone terribly wrong, there was often no witness left to describe where the vehicle had gone. That simple reality made the investigation extraordinarily difficult from its very beginning. The years that followed produced theories, speculation, and countless names suggested by the public. Among them was Ted Bundy, whose crimes in the western United States have often overshadowed other unsolved cases from the same era. Some observers pointed to similarities in victim selection. One witness would later say that a man seen approaching two of the earliest victims resembled Bundy. Yet resemblance is not proof. Investigators found no DNA linking Bundy to these murders. No fingerprints connecting him to the victims, no confession, and no verified evidence placing him in Santa Rosa during the relevant period. His name remains part of the conversation surrounding the case, but not part of its solution. Other suspects have surfaced over the decades, some proposed by investigators, others by family members or private citizens who believe they had uncovered overlooked evidence. Even in recent years, Allegations involving deceased individuals have prompted renewed examination of preserved materials and modern DNA testing. Still, no official conclusion has emerged. Every new possibility has ultimately returned investigators to the same frustrating reality. There is not enough evidence to identify the killer beyond reasonable doubt. That uncertainty has become one of the defining characteristics of the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders. It is a case built as much upon what investigators do not know as upon what they do. They do not know where the victims were actually killed. They do not know whether every confirmed victim encountered the same offender. They do not know whether additional disappearances belong within the same series. Most importantly, they do not know who committed these crimes. For the families, those unanswered questions have endured for more than 50 years. Time may soften memories, but it rarely diminishes loss. Behind every investigative report stood parents waiting for daughters who never returned home, siblings forced to grow older without them, and communities forever marked by tragedies that transformed everyday routines into sources of fear. The victims were never simply names listed in police files. They were children, students, friends, daughters, and young women whose futures ended on ordinary roads that countless others traveled without a second thought. As investigators slowly assembled the scattered pieces of evidence across Sonoma County, one realization became impossible to ignore. These disappearances were no longer isolated incidents connected only by geography or chance. A disturbing pattern had emerged, suggesting that somewhere among the quiet highways and rural backroads of Northern California, a careful and methodical killer had been operating unnoticed. And for nearly 2 years, no one knew who he was, where he would strike next, or how many lives he had already claimed. Before investigators recognized a pattern, before newspapers began asking whether Northern California was facing a serial killer, there were simply 2 missing girls whose families expected them to come home. Their disappearance would become the first confirmed chapter of what is now known as the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders. But on the evening of February 4th, 1972, there was nothing to suggest that history was quietly beginning to unfold. Maureen Sterling was 12 years old. Yvonne Weber was 13. Like countless young teenagers, they were looking forward to an ordinary evening rather than stepping unknowingly into one of California's longest-running unsolved mysteries. The 2 friends spent that Friday night at the Redwood Empire Ice Arena in Santa Rosa, a popular gathering place where local teenagers met to skate, laugh, and enjoy a few carefree hours together. The rink represented something familiar and safe. Parents dropped off their children knowing they would spend the evening surrounded by friends, music, and other families. There was no reason to imagine that the journey home would become the last known chapter of 2 young lives. Around 9 o'clock that evening, Maureen and Yvonne left the skating rink. The destination was home, and like many teenagers of the era, they relied on hitchhiking to complete the trip. During the early 1970s, this was not viewed with the same alarm it would generate today. Throughout California, especially among students and young people, standing beside a road and accepting a ride from a passing driver had become a routine part of daily life. Highway shoulders often served as informal meeting points between strangers whose paths crossed for only a few miles. The system relied almost entirely upon trust. Most rides ended exactly as expected, with passengers thanking the driver before continuing on with their day. It was that widespread sense of normalcy that made predators exceptionally difficult to recognize. Someone willing to exploit such trust could blend almost perfectly into ordinary traffic. As Maureen and Yvonne made their way toward Guerneville Road, witnesses noticed the 2 girls hitchhiking. At the time, the sight attracted little attention. 2 teenagers attempting to catch a ride home did not appear unusual. No one watching from a distance could have known that this ordinary moment would later become one of the most significant observations in the investigation. Years after the murders, another account emerged from someone who had also been at the skating rink that evening. According to this individual, a tall, thin man approached the girls and invited them to smoke marijuana. The witness declined the invitation. Maureen and Yvonne, however, left not long afterward. This account eventually became one of the most discussed pieces of testimony associated with the case. Not because it conclusively identified anyone, but because of what the witness later added. Long after the crimes, the witness expressed the opinion that the man resembled Ted Bundy. That statement has often been repeated whenever the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders are discussed. But it is important to separate speculation from established fact. The resemblance was only the witness's personal impression offered years later. It did not establish Bundy's identity, nor did investigators uncover physical evidence placing him at the scene. No DNA, fingerprints, confession, or verified travel record have ever confirmed his involvement. The account remains part of the historical record because investigators documented it. But it does not resolve the mystery of who approached the girls that evening. After Maureen and Yvonne disappeared, uncertainty quickly turned into fear for those closest to them. Families searched for answers while investigators attempted to reconstruct their final known movements. Yet almost immediately, the case confronted a devastating problem. Once the girls accepted a ride or otherwise left the area where they had last been seen, there was little evidence to follow. No confirmed vehicle description led investigators toward a suspect. No identified driver came forward to explain what had happened after the girls disappeared from Guerneville Road. The trail simply ended. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Hope gradually gave way to painful uncertainty. For investigators, missing person cases become increasingly difficult as time passes. Witnesses struggle to remember details accurately. Memories fade. Physical evidence disappears. Every passing day reduces the likelihood of discovering fresh clues capable of identifying a suspect. In this case, those challenges would become even more severe. Nearly 11 months passed before the mystery surrounding Maureen Sterling and Yvonne Weber finally produced another answer. Although it was not the answer anyone had hoped to receive. On December 28, 1972, skeletal remains were discovered in a remote ravine along Franz Valley Road. The location was isolated, far removed from the skating rink where the girls had last been seen. By the time the remains were recovered, nature had erased almost every forensic clue that investigators desperately needed. Medical examiners faced an impossible task. The extensive decomposition meant they could not determine exactly how the girls had died. They could not establish whether either victim had been sexually assaulted. Time had stripped away the evidence that might have answered those critical questions. Instead of a detailed forensic reconstruction, investigators were left with only fragments. Among the items recovered at the scene were an earring, several orange beads, and a gold necklace bearing a cross. These personal belongings became some of the few tangible reminders of two young lives that had ended long before their families received confirmation of their fate. The discovery brought a measure of certainty to one question while opening countless others. The girls had not run away. They had not voluntarily disappeared. They had been murdered. Yet the manner of their deaths remained unknown, and the person responsible remained completely unidentified. The location where their remains were found also raised new questions. Detectives increasingly suspected that Franz Valley Road was not where the murders had actually occurred. Instead, the ravine appeared more likely to have served as a place where the bodies were abandoned after the crimes had already taken place elsewhere. If that assumption was correct, then investigators had been searching in the wrong location from the very beginning. The true crime scene and the evidence it might have contained remained undiscovered. That realization would become one of the defining frustrations of the entire investigation. Without access to the original murder site, detectives lost the opportunity to recover fingerprints, tire impressions, fibers, biological evidence, or other forensic clues that could have survived in a less exposed environment. Instead, the only confirmed scene available to investigators had endured months of weather, wildlife, and natural decomposition. Whatever evidence had once existed had largely vanished. As detectives reviewed every known fact surrounding the disappearance, they found themselves confronted by a disturbing possibility. 2 young girls had vanished after leaving a familiar public location. They had been seen hitchhiking. Their remains had eventually been discovered in an isolated rural area. Yet, despite months of investigation, the case had yielded almost no physical evidence pointing towards suspect. The murderer had left remarkably little behind. At first, investigators could not know whether these murders represented a unique tragedy or the beginning of something much larger. Serial murder investigations often become recognizable only in hindsight, after similarities emerge across multiple cases. In early 1972, there simply was not enough information to establish such a pattern. Maureen Sterling and Yvonne Weber's deaths stood as an unsolved double homicide surrounded by unanswered questions. But as detectives continued examining disappearances throughout Sonoma County, another young woman would soon vanish under circumstances that were impossible to ignore. Unlike the first 2 victims, her body would provide investigators with evidence of restraint, sexual assault, and prolonged strangulation. Those findings would dramatically alter the direction of the investigation and force law enforcement to confront a frightening possibility. The murders of Maureen Sterling and Yvonne Weber might not have been an isolated crime at all. Instead, they could represent the opening acts of a methodical killer whose crimes were only beginning to reveal themselves. The disappearance of Maureen Sterling and Yvonne Weber had already left investigators struggling with more questions than answers. Months of uncertainty, followed by the heartbreaking discovery of their skeletal remains, demonstrated just how quickly crucial evidence could disappear. Yet despite the tragedy, detectives still could not say with confidence whether they were confronting an isolated double homicide or the first signs of something far more dangerous. That uncertainty would not last long. Only weeks after the 2 girls vanished, another young woman disappeared under circumstances that would fundamentally change the investigation. This time, investigators would recover a body before nature had erased every clue. While the identity of the killer remained hidden, the evidence surrounding this victim revealed a level of violence that suggested planning, control, and a method that could not easily be dismissed as random. Her name was Kim Wendy Allen. At 19 years old, Kim represented the optimism of someone beginning adulthood. She was a student at Santa Rosa Junior College, pursuing her education while balancing the ordinary responsibilities of work and daily life. Like many young people during the early 1970s, she navigated Northern California with the confidence that hitchhiking was simply another way to travel. For students without reliable transportation, accepting rides from strangers was not viewed as extraordinary. It was common, affordable, and deeply woven into the culture of the time. Few people imagined that the very practice intended to bridge the distance between destinations could instead place someone in the path of a predator. On March 4th, 1972, Kim completed her shift at a natural food store. It was an ordinary day with an ordinary ending. Nothing in the available facts suggests that she believed she was in danger or that anything unusual had occurred during her workday. Like countless evenings before, she simply needed a way to continue her journey. According to investigators, 2 men gave Kim a ride as far as San Rafael. Their identities have never been publicly established as the individuals responsible for her death. What is known is that after reaching San Rafael, Kim continued hitchhiking in an effort to return to Santa Rosa Junior College. That decision would mark the last confirmed sighting of her alive. Somewhere between the moment she resumed looking for another ride and the following morning, Kim disappeared. Unlike modern investigations, there were no mobile phones to trace, no surveillance cameras documenting highways, no digital transactions capable of reconstructing her movements. Once she stepped into the wrong vehicle or otherwise vanished from public view, her trail effectively ended. Investigators could only work backward from the evidence that would later emerge. The next morning, Kim's body was discovered beneath a creek embankment along Enterprise Road. The location immediately drew attention because it was isolated enough to conceal the crime while remaining accessible by vehicle. Detectives examining the scene noticed signs suggesting that whoever disposed of the body may have struggled while doing so. Marks on the slope indicated that the individual responsible might have slipped while dragging or pushing the body down the embankment. It was a small but significant observation. Although it did not identify the killer, it demonstrated that even carefully planned crimes could leave behind subtle traces of human movement. Those slide marks hinted at a physical effort required to conceal the victim, reminding investigators that the offender was not invisible, only extraordinarily difficult to identify. The medical examination revealed details far more disturbing than those available in the earlier double homicide. Kim's hands and feet had been bound. The restraints demonstrated that the offender had exercised deliberate control over the victim before her death. This was not evidence of a sudden confrontation or an impulsive act of violence. The bindings suggested planning and the intention to overpower the victim while limiting any opportunity to escape. The examination also concluded that Kim had been sexually assaulted. Unlike the skeletal remains of Maureen and Yvonne, where decomposition prevented investigators from answering such questions, Kim's body provided evidence that clarified at least one aspect of the attack. Sexual violence had occurred. Perhaps the most chilling finding involved the cause of death. Investigators determined that Kim had been strangled with a cord over a prolonged period, estimated at approximately 30 minutes. The significance of that conclusion extended beyond the brutality of the act itself. Manual or ligature strangulation is not instantaneous. It requires sustained pressure and continued physical control. The estimated duration suggested that the offender remained with the victim throughout the assault, maintaining that control for an extended period before death occurred. The available evidence painted the picture of an offender who acted methodically rather than impulsively. Every confirmed detail reinforced the impression that this crime involved restraint, patience, and deliberate actions rather than uncontrolled rage. Investigators also recovered biological evidence, including semen from Kim's body. Today, such evidence would likely become one of the central pillars of a homicide investigation. Modern DNA analysis has solved countless cold cases using preserved biological material collected decades earlier. In 1972, however, forensic science had not yet reached that level of sophistication. Detectives understood that the evidence was important, but they lacked the technological means to identify a suspect through genetic testing. The biological material could be preserved, documented, and compared only within the limited scientific capabilities of the era. It represented a potentially invaluable clue that investigators simply could not fully use at the time. Alongside the biological evidence, detectives recovered a gold earring. Whether it belonged to Kim or held any direct investigative value beyond documenting the scene, it became another carefully cataloged item within an increasingly complex case file. Every object recovered was examined in the hope that it might reveal something overlooked. Yet, as with so many other pieces of evidence, the earring alone could not identify the individual responsible. The investigation into Kim Allen's murder forced detectives to reconsider what they had previously believed about the disappearance of Maureen Sterling and Yvonne Weber. While the first case had been severely limited by decomposition, Kim's murder revealed specific behavioral patterns that investigators could now compare against earlier evidence. Once again, a young female had disappeared after hitchhiking. Once again, her body had been abandoned in a relatively isolated location rather than left where the crime likely occurred. Once again, the offender appeared to have taken steps to minimize the amount of evidence available to investigators. Although the circumstances differed, the similarities were becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. At this stage, detectives could not yet conclusively declare that the murders had been committed by the same individual. Responsible investigators avoid making such assumptions without sufficient evidence. Nevertheless, the pattern demanded careful attention. The victims belonged to a similar age group. Both incidents involved young women traveling alone after accepting or seeking rides. Both investigations confronted the same frustrating absence of witnesses capable of identifying the offender after the victims disappeared. Most significantly, neither investigation had produced a viable suspect despite extensive efforts. The possibility that a single offender was responsible could no longer be ignored. Kim Allen's murder also highlighted another troubling reality. The offender appeared capable of adapting to circumstances while maintaining consistent objectives. In one case, decomposition erased nearly every clue. In another, biological evidence existed but exceeded the scientific capabilities of the period. Whether by planning or circumstance, the killer repeatedly benefited from the limitations facing law enforcement in the early 1970s. There were no DNA databases, no digital surveillance networks, and no modern forensic genealogy. Investigators relied heavily upon eyewitness testimony, physical evidence recovered from crime scenes, and traditional detective work. When those elements were absent or incomplete, cases often remained unsolved for years or forever. As news of another murdered young woman spread, concern throughout Sonoma County deepened. Parents worried about daughters traveling alone. Communities that had once viewed hitchhiking as an ordinary convenience began questioning whether familiar roads had become hunting grounds for someone whose identity remained completely unknown. Yet despite growing public anxiety, investigators still possessed no name, no confirmed suspect, and no direct path toward solving the crimes. What they did have was an emerging pattern, one that suggested the deaths of Maureen Sterling, Yvonne Weber, and Kim Wendy Allen might not represent separate tragedies at all, but instead the deliberate work of a careful offender whose crimes were only beginning to reveal their full scope. Soon, another young girl would disappear, and with her case, the disturbing pattern would become even more difficult to deny. By the end of 1972, investigators in Northern California found themselves facing an increasingly unsettling reality. The murders of Maureen Sterling, Yvonne Weber, and Kim Wendy Allen had each presented different forensic challenges. Yet beneath those differences lay a series of similarities that were becoming difficult to ignore. Young female victims, disappearances connected to hitchhiking, bodies abandoned in isolated locations rather than at obvious crime scenes. Very little evidence pointing toward the person responsible. Still, detectives remained cautious. Similarities alone could not prove that a single offender stood behind every case. Each investigation had to be examined on its own facts. But before law enforcement could establish firm conclusions, another young girl vanished. Her case would add another layer to an already disturbing pattern while introducing new questions that investigators would never fully answer. Lori Lee Corsa was 13 years old. Unlike some of the previous victims, Lori was known to have run away from home on previous occasions. That fact became part of the early investigation, but it also illustrated one of the recurring difficulties detectives faced during the early stages of missing person cases. When a young person had a history of leaving home voluntarily, it could initially complicate efforts to determine whether a disappearance resulted from personal choice or criminal intervention. Investigators nevertheless continued gathering information about Lori's movements because every hour mattered. According to the available information, Lori disappeared toward the end of November 1972. Several people later reported seeing her hitchhiking. In the context of the early 1970s, such sightings did not immediately identify danger. Hitchhiking remained a common means of transportation, particularly among teenagers and young adults who lacked access to reliable vehicles. Yet with multiple unsolved disappearances already under investigation, every report involving a young hitchhiker carried increasing significance. Detectives attempted to reconstruct Lori's final known movements, but as in the earlier cases, certainty quickly disappeared once she left public view. There were no confirmed witnesses who could describe every step of her journey after she was last seen. The investigation once again confronted the same frustrating gap between the victim's final confirmed sighting and the eventual discovery of her body. On December 14, 1972, Lori's body was found in a ravine off Calistoga Road. The location itself immediately attracted investigators' attention because it reflected another isolated rural setting, similar in some respects to previous recovery sites. Once again, detectives questioned whether the location represented the actual murder scene or merely the place where the body had been discarded. The evidence available suggested the latter remained a distinct possibility. Medical examination revealed that Lori had suffered a broken neck and injuries to her spinal cord. Unlike Kim Winnie Allen's case, investigators found no evidence indicating that Lori had been sexually assaulted. That difference became an important consideration during the investigation. Detectives understood that serial offenders do not necessarily commit identical crimes each time. At the same time, they resisted assuming every apparent similarity automatically proved a common offender. Each forensic finding required careful evaluation on its own merits. Lori's injuries also indicated that considerable force had been involved. Evidence suggested her body had been thrown down a ravine approximately 15 meters deep. Whether those injuries occurred before or during the body's descent could not fully answer every question surrounding her death. But the disposal method reinforced the impression that the offender sought remote locations where discovery might be delayed. The terrain itself worked against investigators. Ravines, steep embankments, and isolated roads complicated search efforts while exposing evidence to weather and natural deterioration. During the investigation, detectives received another potentially significant piece of information. A witness later reported seeing two men forcing a girl resembling Lori into a van before driving toward Calistoga Road. On its face, the account appeared important. If accurate, it suggested the possibility of an abduction involving more than one individual. Yet responsible investigations cannot rely solely upon testimony that cannot be independently verified. Witnesses may remember events imperfectly, especially after time has passed. Descriptions may unintentionally change. Similar-looking individuals can easily be mistaken for one another. As a result, although investigators documented the account and considered it carefully, the information ultimately proved insufficient to identify suspects or establish exactly what had occurred. The reported sighting remains part of the historical record surrounding Lori's case, but it has never led to a confirmed breakthrough. By this stage, detectives found themselves confronting an investigation marked by recurring frustrations. Leads emerged, but could not be fully verified. Witnesses remembered isolated moments, but rarely the complete sequence of events. Physical evidence remained limited. Every new case expanded the pattern while simultaneously exposing the limitations of available investigative tools. Before those questions could be resolved, another disappearance would deepen the mystery. Carolyn Nadine Davis was 14 years old. Like Lori, Carolyn had run away from home earlier in 1973. That background again complicated the earliest stages of the investigation, illustrating how vulnerable young runaways could become when traveling without reliable support or transportation. On July 15, 1973, Carolyn's grandmother drove her to the post office in Garberville. From there, Carolyn intended to continue traveling by hitchhiking along Highway 101. This final confirmed interaction stands as one of the last documented moments before she disappeared. The image is remarkably ordinary. A grandmother dropping off her granddaughter. A young girl preparing to continue her journey. Nothing in the available facts suggested that either of them could have anticipated what would follow. After Carolyn began hitchhiking, she vanished. As with the earlier victims, investigators could determine little about her movements after she left the last known location. The absence of confirmed sightings after that point meant detectives once again faced an investigation with a rapidly disappearing trail. Highway 101 stretched across vast distances, carrying countless travelers every day. Any one of those passing vehicles might have offered Carolyn a ride. Determining which driver she accepted transportation from became nearly impossible. Months later, in December 1973, Carolyn's body was discovered near the Santa Cruz coast. By the time of recovery, decomposition had advanced to such an extent that medical examiners could not determine the precise cause of death. This tragic reality echoed the difficulties investigators had already experienced with Maureen Sterling and Yvonne Weber. Once again, the passage of time had erased answers that no later scientific examination could fully restore. Detectives examined Carolyn's case alongside the earlier investigations, searching for both similarities and differences. Once again, the victim was a young female. Once again, hitchhiking formed part of the final known circumstances before her disappearance. Once again, the body had been recovered in a location that may not have represented the original crime scene. Yet critical forensic questions remained unanswered because decomposition had destroyed evidence, capable of clarifying exactly how she died. Each new victim added another piece to an incomplete puzzle while simultaneously emphasizing how much information had already been lost forever. By late 1973, the growing list of victims forced investigators to think beyond individual case files. They began comparing timelines, victim characteristics, disposal sites, and available evidence more systematically. Certain themes continued to emerge. The victims were all young females, generally within their teens or early 20s. Several had last been seen while hitchhiking. Bodies repeatedly appeared in isolated outdoor locations, often near rural roads, creeks, or ravines where discovery could be delayed. The apparent absence of original murder scenes significantly limited forensic opportunities. Although not every victim exhibited identical injuries or forensic findings, the broader pattern remained striking enough to demand continued examination. At the same time, detectives resisted overstating what the evidence actually proved. Responsible criminal investigations require distinctions between possibility and certainty. Lori's reported witness account involving two men and a van could not be confirmed. Carolyn's precise cause of death remained undetermined because of decomposition. The differences among victims prevented investigators from drawing simplistic conclusions. Instead, they continued assembling every available fact while acknowledging the substantial gaps that remained. Those gaps would define the investigation for decades. As families searched for answers and communities struggled to understand why these crimes continued without resolution. Another case would soon emerge that investigators considered deeply significant. Unlike several of the younger victims, The next confirmed victim was 23 years old and traveling across California by choice. Her murder would reveal unmistakable evidence of restraint, sexual assault, and ligature strangulation. It would also reinforce investigators' growing belief that whoever was responsible understood how to isolate vulnerable travelers, kill away from public view, and dispose of bodies in locations where time and nature would steadily erase the truth. By the closing weeks of 1973, the fear surrounding the unexplained murders in Northern California had not disappeared. Instead, it had grown heavier with each passing month. Investigators had examined multiple disappearances involving young females whose final known movements often shared unsettling similarities. Families waited for answers that never came, while detectives attempted to connect fragments of evidence spread across different counties and different crime scenes. Yet despite months of work, no identifiable suspect had emerged. The investigation remained trapped between recurring patterns and missing proof. Then, near the end of December, another victim entered the case. Her death would become one of the most significant chapters in the investigation because it once again demonstrated a combination of restraint, sexual violence, and deliberate body disposal that investigators could not ignore. Her name was Teresa Walsh. At 23 years old, Teresa was older than several of the previous confirmed victims. But she shared one characteristic that detectives had begun to view with increasing concern. She traveled by hitchhiking. During the early 1970s, this remained a common way for people to move across long distances, particularly for those seeking inexpensive transportation. Travelers depended upon passing motorists, often accepting rides from complete strangers with little more than a brief conversation before entering the vehicle. For most people, those encounters ended safely. Unfortunately, the investigation into the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murder suggested that someone had learned to exploit that trust with devastating efficiency. On December 22, 1973, Teresa was last seen at Zuma Beach in Malibu. According to the available facts, she was attempting to return to Northern California by hitchhiking. The image is striking in its simplicity. A young woman standing beside a roadway, preparing to continue a journey that countless other travelers had completed safely before her. There is nothing within the established record suggesting that Teresa believed she faced immediate danger. Like the other victims, she disappeared somewhere after beginning a trip that should have ended with her arrival rather than her absence. Once Teresa vanished, investigators again encountered the familiar problem that had complicated nearly every earlier case. Her last confirmed location was known, but the critical period between that moment and the discovery of her body remained almost entirely undocumented. There were no confirmed witnesses capable of describing every stage of her journey. No verified account established which vehicle she ultimately entered after she was last seen. No confirmed evidence revealed where she spent her final hours. As in the earlier investigations, the trail simply disappeared once she left public view. 6 days later, Teresa's body was discovered at Mark West Creek in Sonoma County. The location immediately drew investigators' attention because it fit a broader pattern already emerging within the investigation. Like several previous recovery sites, Mark West Creek was an isolated area where a body could remain unnoticed for some time. Detectives carefully examined the surroundings while considering an increasingly important question. Had the murder occurred there? Or had the offender simply transported the body to that location afterward? Available evidence pointed detectives toward the second possibility. Medical examination revealed that Teresa had been bound in what investigators described as a hogtie position, with her hands and feet secured behind her back. This form of restraint immediately distinguished the case because it demonstrated deliberate, physical control over the victim. Binding someone in this manner requires both time and intention. It is not a random consequence of spontaneous violence. Instead, it reflected purposeful actions taken before death occurred. Investigators viewed this evidence alongside the earlier finding that Kim Wendy Allen had also been restrained before being killed. Although each case contained important differences, the recurring presence of binding further strengthened concerns that detectives were confronting a calculated offender rather than unrelated crimes. The examination also concluded that Teresa had been sexually assaulted. This finding echoed one of the most significant forensic discoveries made in Kim Allen's case. While decomposition had prevented similar determinations in several earlier investigations, the evidence available in Teresa's murder demonstrated that sexual violence formed part of at least some of the confirmed attacks. Detectives remained careful not to assume identical motives across every victim, particularly when decomposition had limited conclusions in other cases. Nevertheless, each new confirmed finding expanded their understanding of the offender's possible behavior. Teresa's cause of death was determined to be strangulation. This represented another notable similarity to Kim Allen's murder. Although different methods of restraint have been documented, ligature strangulation appeared again as the fatal mechanism. Investigators recognized that strangulation differs from many other forms of homicide because it generally requires sustained physical control over the victim. It is not an act completed instantly. Instead, it involves prolonged contact between offender and victim. Such findings reinforce the impression that whoever committed these crimes exercised patience, planning, and confidence while carrying out the attacks. Another important factor complicated the investigation. Heavy rainfall had affected the area before Teresa's body was discovered. Detectives believe that the rain may have caused the body to move from its original resting place, potentially carrying it downstream. If that assumption proved correct, identifying the exact location where the body had initially been placed became significantly more difficult. This uncertainty mattered because every meter between the disposal point and the recovery location represented additional opportunities for evidence to disappear. Water can wash away footprints, disturb trace evidence, relocate personal belongings, and alter the relationship between a body and its surroundings. For investigators already struggling with limited forensic opportunities, the effects of weather introduced yet another obstacle. The possibility that Mark West Creek represented only a recovery site rather than the true disposal point further strengthened an observation detectives had gradually formed throughout the investigation. In several cases, the places where victims were found did not appear consistent with the locations where the murders themselves had likely occurred. Instead, investigators increasingly believe that the offender selected remote outdoor areas specifically for abandoning bodies after the crimes had already taken place elsewhere. If that assessment was correct, then detectives were repeatedly examining secondary scenes while the primary murder locations remained undiscovered. This distinction may explain why so little forensic evidence was recovered throughout the investigation. The actual places where victims were attacked and where the offender may have left fingerprints, fibers, or other physical traces were never identified. By late 1973, detectives possessed enough information to compare the confirmed victims more systematically. Although important differences remained among individual cases, several recurring characteristics continue to stand out. The victims were all young females, ranging from 12 to 23 years old. Hitchhiking appeared repeatedly in the final confirmed stages of several victims' journeys. Bodies were recovered in isolated outdoor locations, frequently near creeks, ravines, or rural roads. At least some victims had been restrained. Sexual assault had been confirmed in certain cases. Strangulation appeared more than once as the cause of death. The disposal sites yielded remarkably little physical evidence capable of identifying the offender. These observations did not solve the murders. but they strengthened investigators' belief that the similarities deserved serious consideration. At the same time, detectives understood that criminal investigations require caution. Similar patterns can guide an investigation, but they cannot replace evidence. Every conclusion had to remain grounded in verified facts rather than assumptions. That disciplined approach became especially important as public interest in the murders continued to grow. Speculation inevitably accompanied every major unsolved case. Yet investigators remained focused on what they could actually prove. Unfortunately, despite extensive efforts, the list of confirmed facts remained painfully short when compared to the number of unanswered questions. Teresa Walsh's murder effectively marked the final confirmed victim within the time frame described by investigators for the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders. By then, at least 7 young women and girls had lost their lives. Families continued living with uncertainty, while detectives faced one of the most difficult challenges of their careers. They believed a pattern existed. They believed the offender deliberately selected vulnerable victims. They believed bodies had likely been transported after the murders to remote disposal sites. Yet belief alone could not produce an arrest. The investigation still lacked the single piece of evidence capable of identifying the person responsible beyond reasonable doubt. As 1973 came to an end, law enforcement shifted increasingly toward examining the murders collectively rather than individually. Investigators began comparing victimology, timelines, disposal methods, and forensic findings in greater detail, hoping that somewhere within those comparisons lay the overlooked connection that could finally reveal the identity of the unknown killer. Whether that answer still existed within the surviving evidence, or whether it had disappeared forever with the passing years, would become the defining question of one of America's most enduring unsolved serial murder investigations. As the confirmed murders accumulated between 1972 and 1973, investigators faced a challenge that extended far beyond solving individual homicides. Each victim had her own timeline, her own family, and her own circumstances before disappearing. At first, detectives naturally approached every case as a separate investigation. Missing person reports were assigned, witness statements were collected, recovery sites were examined, and medical examiners documented whatever evidence remained. Yet, as additional victims were discovered, the similarities became increasingly difficult to dismiss. The question was no longer whether each investigation contained unanswered questions. The larger question had become whether those unanswered questions all pointed toward the same unknown offender. Reaching that conclusion required careful comparison rather than assumption. Detectives began reviewing every confirmed fact from each case, searching for recurring patterns that could withstand close examination. One of the clearest observations involved the victims themselves. Every confirmed victim was a young female. Their ages ranged from just 12 years old to 23. Although they came from different backgrounds and their personal circumstances were not identical, investigators recognized that they all belonged to an age group that frequently relied on hitchhiking as a practical form of transportation during the early 1970s. This observation did not prove that hitchhiking caused the crimes, nor did it suggest that every hitchhiker faced similar danger. Instead, detectives considered whether the offender deliberately selected individuals who were temporarily isolated, dependent upon passing motorists, and therefore especially vulnerable to someone willing to misuse that trust. Victimology, the careful study of common characteristics among victims, became an increasingly important part of the investigation. Another recurring element emerged when detectives reconstructed the victims' final known movements. Several had last been seen while hitchhiking or preparing to continue their journeys by accepting rides from strangers. In each instance, investigators confronted the same frustrating limitation. The final confirmed sighting usually occurred before the victim entered an unidentified vehicle or otherwise disappeared from public view. After that point, certainty vanished. The absence of surveillance cameras, mobile phones, and digital records reflected the technological realities of the early 1970s. Modern investigators often reconstruct a victim's final hours through electronic evidence, but detectives working these cases possessed no comparable resources. Once a victim accepted transportation from an unknown driver, there was often no reliable method of tracing where the journey continued. This gap between the last confirmed sighting and the discovery of the body became one of the defining obstacles throughout the investigation. Detectives also examined the locations where victims were eventually found. Although the recovery sites differed geographically, they shared notable characteristics. Bodies had been abandoned near rural roads, creeks, ravines, or other isolated outdoor locations where discovery might be delayed. Such environments complicated investigations in multiple ways. Remote terrain reduced the likelihood that witnesses would observe suspicious activity. Natural exposure accelerated decomposition. Rainfall, wildlife, and changing environmental conditions steadily destroyed fragile evidence that might otherwise have survived. Even when investigators reached these locations, they often questioned whether they were examining genuine crime scenes or merely places chosen for body disposal. That distinction remained critical throughout the investigation. If the murders occurred elsewhere, then detectives were repeatedly searching locations that contained only limited traces of the offender's actions. The true scenes of the crimes, and whatever evidence they once held, remained unidentified. This possibility helps explain why investigators recovered so little physical evidence capable of identifying the killer. The confirmed forensic findings further demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of the investigation. Kim Wendy Allen's case produced evidence that she had been bound, sexually assaulted, and strangled with a cord. Biological evidence, including semen, was collected. At the time, investigators recognized its potential importance. However, forensic science in 1972 had not yet developed DNA profiling capable of identifying an unknown offender from preserved biological material. The evidence could be documented and retained, but it could not answer the central question of identity. Teresa Walsh's murder similarly revealed restraint, sexual assault, and strangulation, reinforcing concerns that investigators were observing recurring behavioral elements across multiple cases. Yet other victims presented different challenges. In the cases of Maureen Sterling, Yvonne Weber, and Carolyn Nadine Davis, decomposition had progressed so extensively that medical examiners could not determine every aspect of how the victims died. Critical questions, including whether sexual assault had occurred in some instances, could no longer be answered with certainty. Lori Lee Corse's examination established injuries to her neck and spinal cord, but found no evidence of sexual assault. Detectives, therefore, faced a complicated body of evidence that contained both similarities and differences, requiring cautious interpretation rather than simplistic conclusions. Whether repeatedly complicated investigative efforts. Teresa Walsh's recovery illustrated how heavy rain may have altered the location of her body after disposal, making it difficult to establish precisely where the offender originally left her. Similar environmental challenges affected other recovery sites as well. Exposure to seasonal conditions, flowing water, and natural decomposition gradually erased footprints, fibers, biological traces, and other forms of physical evidence. Every day that passed before discovery reduced investigators' opportunities to reconstruct events accurately. Unlike controlled indoor crime scenes, remote outdoor environments change continuously. Detectives often arrived after nature had already begun destroying the very evidence they hoped to recover. Time itself became one of the offender's greatest allies. Investigators also considered the apparent behavior of the offender based solely upon confirmed evidence. The pattern suggested someone capable of approaching young women without immediately provoking alarm. Since several victims were associated with hitchhiking, detectives believe the offender may have gained initial access by offering transportation or otherwise establishing enough trust for victims to enter a vehicle voluntarily. Importantly, investigators could not prove exactly how each encounter began because no confirmed witnesses observed the complete sequence of events. Nevertheless, the repeated association between hitchhiking and disappearance encouraged detectives to examine whether the offender deliberately sought opportunities created by ordinary social interactions rather than public confrontations. Once the victims disappeared, the available evidence suggested they were transported elsewhere before being killed or before their bodies were abandoned. The absence of identified murder scenes remained one of the most significant obstacles throughout the investigation. Without locating the places where the fatal attacks actually occurred, detectives lost access to countless opportunities for forensic examination. Indoor locations, secluded structures, or private properties that might once have contained fingerprints, fibers, bloodstains, or other trace evidence were never identified. Instead, investigators repeatedly examined outdoor recovery sites where environmental conditions had already removed much of the remaining evidence. As detectives expanded their review across all confirmed victims, another challenge emerged. Similarity does not automatically establish common responsibility. Criminal investigations require evidence linking offenses together rather than relying solely upon comparable circumstances. While young female victims, hitchhiking, remote disposal sites, and limited forensic evidence suggested a possible pattern, investigators understood the importance of avoiding unsupported conclusions. Every connection required careful evaluation against the available facts. That disciplined approach sometimes appeared frustrating to observers hoping for quick answers, but it reflected the fundamental responsibility of investigators to distinguish evidence from speculation. Public concern continued growing as awareness of the cases spread. Families naturally questioned whether a serial offender remained at large. Communities wondered whether young women traveling alone faced continuing danger. Investigators shared many of those concerns, but remained committed to following the evidence, wherever it led, rather than where public opinion expected it to go. Every witness statement was reviewed. Every recovered item was documented. Every forensic report was compared with previous findings. Detectives searched for recurring details capable of identifying a vehicle, connecting recovery locations, or narrowing the pool of possible suspects. Yet despite those efforts, no decisive breakthrough emerged. The technological limitations of the era remained impossible to overcome. DNA identification did not yet exist. Computerized investigative databases were unavailable. Information often had to be compared manually across separate case files. The absence of modern forensic tools meant that even potentially valuable evidence could not always be interpreted in ways that seem routine today. As the years passed, many investigators continued believing that the offender had been unusually careful. Whether through deliberate planning, fortunate circumstance, or both, the individual responsible appeared to have avoided leaving behind the kind of evidence most likely to establish identity. Bodies were discovered only after valuable time had passed. Recovery sites yielded limited forensic material. Witnesses observed fragments of events rather than complete sequences. Every investigative path seemed to end just short of certainty. By the conclusion of the active investigations into the confirmed murders, detectives had assembled a remarkably detailed understanding of the victims, their final known movements, and the recurring characteristics connecting the cases. What they lacked was the one element every homicide investigation ultimately requires: the identity of the person responsible. That absence would shape the decades that followed, as investigators, families, and later generations continued searching for answers in a case where the pattern appeared increasingly clear. But the killer remained entirely unknown. As the investigation stretched beyond the initial years of the murders, the absence of a confirmed suspect created an environment in which theories naturally multiplied. Every major unsolved case eventually reaches a point where public curiosity begins filling the spaces left by missing evidence. Families seek answers that official investigations have been unable to provide. Journalists revisit old files in search of overlooked details. Independent researchers compare timelines, locations, and known offenders from the same era. The Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders proved no different. Yet throughout the decades, investigators repeatedly faced the same challenge that had defined the case from the beginning: distinguishing between speculation and evidence. Numerous ideas emerged, but remarkably few could be supported by facts strong enough to move the investigation toward a definitive conclusion. Among all the names ever associated with the case, none has attracted more public attention than Ted Bundy. His reputation as one of America's most notorious serial killers has inevitably drawn comparisons. Whenever unsolved murders involving young women from the 1970s are discussed, Bundy operated in the western United States, and certain aspects of his crimes caused some observers to wonder whether he could also have been responsible for the Santa Rosa murders. Investigators understood why the comparison emerged. Both involved young female victims. Both involved offenders who appeared capable of approaching victims without immediately provoking fear. In addition, one witness connected to the earliest confirmed disappearances later stated that a tall, thin man who approached Maureen Sterling and Yvonne Weber at the skating rink resembled Bundy. According to the account, the man invited the girls to smoke marijuana before the victims disappeared later that evening. Over the years, that statement has often been repeated as though it represented a major breakthrough. In reality, investigators treated it far more cautiously. The witness offered only a personal opinion that the individual resembled Bundy. A resemblance, especially one recalled years after the event, does not establish identity. Investigators require corroborating evidence before concluding that a suspect was actually present. In this case, no such corroboration emerged. Detectives found no DNA linking Bundy to any confirmed victim. No fingerprints connected him to the investigations. No confession placed him at the crimes. Perhaps most importantly, investigators never established that Bundy was in Santa Rosa during the relevant period. Without verified evidence placing him there, the theory remained exactly that, a theory. It is understandable why Bundy's name became attached to the case. His documented crimes demonstrated that he targeted young women and operated across multiple states. However, responsible investigations cannot substitute notoriety for proof. The Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders remain unsolved precisely because no available evidence has confirmed Bundy's involvement. The distinction is critical. A famous suspect may generate public interest, but criminal investigations depend upon facts capable of surviving careful scrutiny. Beyond Bundy, investigators examined numerous other individuals over the years. The available information confirms that law enforcement considered multiple suspects, as would be expected in any major serial murder investigation spanning decades. However, despite extensive examination, none of those individuals could be linked to the confirmed murders with evidence sufficient to support criminal charges. Every investigation inevitably encounters persons of interest whose names attract temporary attention before being eliminated or left unproven. The Santa Rosa case followed that familiar pattern. Detectives explored possibilities, compared available evidence, and attempted to identify connections that might explain the recurring victim characteristics and disposal methods. Yet each avenue ultimately returned investigators to the same difficult reality. Suspicion alone is never enough. Decades after the murders, renewed interest in the case produced additional claims from private individuals and family members who believed they had identified possible offenders. Some allegations focused on people who had already died, making traditional investigative methods even more difficult. According to the available information, preserved evidence was submitted for modern DNA testing in connection with some of these accusations. Such developments reflected the growing hope that advances in forensic science might finally answer questions that investigators in the early 1970s had been unable to resolve. The willingness to re-examine old evidence demonstrates an important aspect of modern cold case investigations. Scientific techniques continue evolving, allowing preserved material to be tested in ways unimaginable when the crimes originally occurred. Nevertheless, hope and outcome are not always the same. Despite renewed examinations and modern forensic efforts, no official conclusion identifying the killer has been announced. The investigation, therefore, remains open in the sense that no confirmed resolution has been reached. The continuing uncertainty surrounding the case illustrates a broader truth about unsolved investigations. As years pass without arrests, theories often become increasingly elaborate while the surviving evidence remains unchanged. Detectives, however, cannot rely upon compelling narratives or persuasive personal beliefs. Every proposed suspect must ultimately be measured against physical evidence, verified timelines, witness testimony, and established investigative standards. In the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders, that process has repeatedly demonstrated how extraordinarily difficult it is to solve crimes when the available evidence is limited by time, decomposition, environmental exposure, and the technological constraints that existed during the original investigation. Another reason speculation continues involves the remarkable consistency of several investigative questions that have never been answered. Detectives still do not know where the murders themselves occurred. The locations where bodies were discovered appear, in many instances, to have served primarily as disposal sites rather than primary crime scenes. Without those original locations, investigators have likely been deprived of the richest sources of forensic evidence. Fingerprints, fibers, trace materials, biological evidence, and other microscopic clues that might once have existed at the true murder scenes remain inaccessible because those locations have never been identified. This absence leaves investigators attempting to reconstruct crimes from secondary evidence rather than direct examination of where the fatal attacks actually took place. The passage of time has only complicated that challenge further. Witness memories naturally become less reliable after decades. People relocate, pass away, or simply forget details that once seemed insignificant. Physical landscapes also change. Roads are rebuilt, vegetation grows, and environmental conditions alter locations that investigators once searched. Even preserved evidence, while invaluable, cannot always answer every question. DNA may identify a person connected to an object or biological sample, but it cannot automatically reconstruct every event surrounding a crime. In cases where biological evidence is absent or severely limited, even the most advanced forensic techniques have boundaries they cannot cross. Investigators working the Santa Rosa case have therefore confronted not only the limitations of the past, but also the unavoidable realities of time itself. Public fascination with the case has endured precisely because so many essential questions remain unresolved. Why were these particular victims selected? Did a single offender commit every confirmed murder? Or could multiple perpetrators have been responsible? Were there additional victims never officially connected to the investigation? These questions continue generating discussion because definitive answers have never emerged. Yet investigators have consistently resisted declaring conclusions unsupported by evidence. Such restraint may appear unsatisfying to those seeking certainty, but it reflects the discipline required in serious criminal investigations. Accepting an appealing theory without sufficient proof risks replacing one mystery with another. Error. Throughout the decades, the families of the victims have lived alongside this uncertainty. While public attention periodically returns to the case through documentaries, books, newspaper articles, or renewed investigative efforts, the central reality remains unchanged for those who lost daughters, sisters, relatives, and friends. They continue waiting for an answer that has not yet arrived. Every announcement of renewed testing or re-examined evidence carries the possibility of long-awaited resolution, but also the possibility that another promising lead will ultimately end without confirmation. That emotional cycle has become part of the history of the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders as surely as the original crimes themselves. More than 50 years after the first disappearances, investigators possess a clearer understanding of the pattern than they did in 1972. They recognize the recurring victim characteristics, the significance of hitchhiking in several cases, the use of isolated body disposal sites, and the extraordinary care with which the offender appears to have avoided leaving identifying evidence. Yet the one question that has defined the investigation from the very beginning remains unanswered. Who is responsible? Every theory, every suspect, every renewed forensic examination has ultimately returned to that same unresolved point, until evidence capable of providing a definitive identification emerges. The Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders remain not only one of California's most enduring unsolved serial murder investigations, but also a powerful reminder that even the most determined investigative efforts cannot always overcome the silence left behind by a careful killer and the passage of time. More than half a century has passed since the first confirmed victims disappeared along the roads of Northern California. Yet the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders continue to occupy a unique place in the history of American criminal investigations. Many notorious murder cases eventually reach a conclusion. An arrest is made. A suspect confesses. DNA provides the missing answer. A courtroom hears the evidence. And a verdict offers at least some measure of resolution for grieving families. This case followed a very different path. Despite years of investigation, repeated reviews of the evidence, renewed public interest, and advances in forensic science, no one has ever been officially identified as the killer. There has been no arrest, no criminal trial, no conviction, and therefore no final chapter in the legal sense. Instead, the story remains suspended between what investigators know and what they still cannot prove. That absence of resolution is perhaps the defining characteristic of the Santa Rosa hitchhiker. Murders. Throughout the investigation, detectives gradually developed a clearer understanding of the offender's apparent methods, even though they never learned the person's identity. The available evidence suggested someone who selected vulnerable victims with remarkable care. Several confirmed victims were known to hitchhike, a practice that was common during the early 1970s and generally viewed as a practical means of transportation rather than an extraordinary risk. The offender appears to have exploited that ordinary social behavior, rather than forcing victims into vehicles in crowded public places. Investigators believe the killer likely gained their trust first, allowing them to enter voluntarily before transporting them elsewhere. This approach dramatically reduced the likelihood of witnesses recognizing that a crime had begun. By the time the victims disappeared from public view, the opportunity to observe the offender had already passed. Equally significant was the apparent absence of identifiable murder scenes. Detectives repeatedly concluded that the locations where bodies were discovered probably did not. represent the places where the victims were actually killed. Instead, isolated ravines, creek beds, and rural roads appear to have served primarily as disposal sites. This distinction shaped every stage of the investigation. The original crime scenes, wherever they may have been, were never located. Without them, investigators lost access to the physical evidence most likely to identify the offender. Fingerprints, trace fibers, blood evidence, and countless other microscopic details that might once have existed remained permanently beyond reach. The investigation therefore unfolded largely through secondary scenes already affected by weather, time, and natural decomposition. Environmental conditions repeatedly intensified those difficulties. Several victims were not discovered until long after they disappeared. In the cases of Maureen Sterling, Yvonne Weber, and Carolyn Nadine Davis, decomposition prevented medical examiners from determining important aspects of their deaths with certainty. Questions regarding exact causes of death and possible sexual assault could no longer be answered, because the evidence had simply disappeared. In Teresa Walsh's case, investigators believed heavy rainfall may have altered the position of her body after disposal, complicating efforts to establish precisely where it had originally been left. Nature itself became an unintentional participant in concealing the crimes. Every passing day reduced the amount of recoverable evidence, while every storm, changing season, and passing year widened the distance between investigators and the truth they sought. Technology also defined the limits of the investigation. When these murders occurred during the early 1970s, forensic science had not yet developed the DNA profiling techniques that later transformed homicide investigations around the world. Biological evidence collected in cases such as Kim Wendy Allen's could be preserved, but investigators lacked the scientific tools necessary to identify an unknown offender through genetic comparison. Modern detectives routinely solve decades-old murders by analyzing preserved DNA against extensive databases or through advanced forensic genealogy. The investigators working the Santa Rosa cases had no such opportunities at the time. They relied instead upon witness testimony, physical evidence recovered from recovery sites, traditional interviews, and careful comparison between individual investigations. Their work laid the foundation for every later review, even if the technology available to them prevented certain questions from being answered. Over the decades, renewed interest in the case has demonstrated that unsolved investigations are never truly forgotten. As forensic science advanced, preserved evidence received renewed attention. Additional allegations emerged concerning possible suspects, including claims involving individuals who had already died. Some family members and private individuals submitted evidence for DNA testing, hoping that modern scientific methods might finally accomplish what earlier investigations could not. Yet despite these continuing efforts, no official conclusion has identified the killer. The investigation remains a reminder that scientific progress, while extraordinarily powerful, cannot recover evidence that no longer exists or solve every mystery left behind by time. The legacy of the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders extends beyond the investigation itself. The case also reflects a profound cultural shift that occurred during the 1970s. Hitchhiking, once regarded as a relatively ordinary method of travel for students, teenagers, and young adults, gradually became associated with increasing caution. Countless factors contributed to changing public attitudes over the years, but highly publicized crimes involving vulnerable travelers inevitably influenced how communities viewed personal safety. The roads themselves did not change, yet the assumptions surrounding them did. A practice once built upon everyday trust increasingly came to be viewed through the lens of risk. The Santa Rosa murders became part of that broader historical transition. illustrating how criminal acts can alter social behavior far beyond the immediate victims and their families. It is equally important, however, not to reduce this case solely to discussions of criminal methods or investigative failures. At its heart, this story is about people whose lives ended long before they had the opportunity to shape their futures. Maureen Sterling was only 12 years old. Yvonne Weber was 13. Lori Lee Corso was 13. Carolyn Nadine Davis was 14. Kim Winnie Allen was 19. Teresa Walsh was 23. Each name represents an individual rather than a statistic. They were daughters, students, friends, and young women whose lives were interrupted by violence that has never been fully explained. Remembering them as people rather than simply as victims is one of the most meaningful ways to preserve the truth of what occurred. Their families have lived for decades with an absence that cannot be measured merely by the passing of time. Every birthday, holiday, and family gathering has unfolded without the presence of someone who should have been there. Unlike families whose cases conclude with arrests and trials, they have also carried the additional burden of uncertainty. Questions remain where answers should exist. Justice remains incomplete because the identity of the offender has never been officially established. That uncertainty has become part of the legacy inherited by every generation that revisits the investigation. For detectives, the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders remain an example of both determination and limitation. Investigators assembled extensive information about the victims, documented recovery sites with care, preserved valuable evidence whenever possible, and recognized important behavioral patterns linking multiple cases. At the same time, they confronted obstacles that no amount of dedication could fully overcome. Missing crime scenes, delayed discoveries, environmental damage, and the scientific limitations of the era combined to create one of the most challenging homicide investigations in California history. Their inability to solve the case should not be mistaken for a lack of effort. Rather, it illustrates how some crimes occur under circumstances that leave remarkably little behind for investigators to follow. Even today, the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders continue to remind us that certainty and truth are not always discovered at the same moment. Investigators may recognize a pattern without identifying the offender. Families may know their loved ones were victims of murder without ever learning who committed the crime. Communities may remember tragedy long after the evidence has faded. The passage of time answers many questions, but it can also erase opportunities forever. In this case, both realities exist side by side. More than 50 years after the first disappearances, the highways surrounding Santa Rosa still carry travelers toward ordinary destinations. The rural roads, creeks, and valleys where victims were eventually found remain part of the California landscape. They no longer dominate national headlines. Yet they continue to bear silent witness to one of America's most enduring unsolved murder investigations. Somewhere within the history of those years lies the identity of the person responsible, a truth that has so far resisted every investigative effort. Until that truth is established through verifiable evidence, the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders will remain an unfinished chapter in the history of true crime. Not because investigators stopped searching, but because the final answer has never been found. And perhaps that is the most haunting aspect of all. The victims' names are known. Their stories have been preserved. The questions surrounding their final journeys have been carefully documented. But the person who ended those lives remains unidentified, leaving behind a mystery that has endured across generations and a reminder that some of history's darkest roads still lead to destinations we have yet to reach. As the decades continued to pass, the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders became more than an unsolved criminal investigation. They became a symbol of the difficult reality faced by families, detectives, and communities when a case remains unresolved for generations. time has a complicated relationship with cold cases. In some ways, it creates distance. The urgency of the original investigations fades from public attention. Witnesses age. Memories become less precise. Physical locations change. People who once held important information may no longer be available to provide it. Yet time can also create new opportunities. Advances in science can transform old evidence into new leads. Investigators can revisit forgotten files with modern perspectives. Families who spent decades waiting for answers can find renewed hope when technology offers possibilities that did not exist before. The Santa Rosa case has existed within this tension for more than 50 years. Suspended between the loss caused by the passage of time and the possibility that one day the remaining evidence may finally reveal the truth. One of the most difficult aspects of the investigation has always been the uncertainty surrounding the full scope of the crimes. Investigators confirmed at least 7 victims connected to the series, but they have also considered whether other disappearances from the same period could potentially be related. This possibility has never been fully resolved. The confirmed victims shared several characteristics, but determining the exact boundaries of a serial offender's actions is one of the most challenging tasks in any long-term investigation. Some victims may never be identified. Some cases may remain separate tragedies rather than connected crimes. Without definitive evidence linking additional disappearances to the Santa Rosa murders, investigators have been forced to maintain a careful distinction between possibility and proof. This uncertainty has contributed to the enduring mystery surrounding the case. The investigation has also demonstrated how the circumstances surrounding a crime can be as important as the crime itself. In many homicide cases, the location where the victim is found provides investigators with a direct pathway toward understanding what happened. The crime scene can reveal the sequence of events, the offender's actions, and physical evidence capable of establishing identity. In the Santa Rosa murders, that traditional pathway was repeatedly blocked. The places where victims were discovered often appeared to be locations selected for disposal rather than the actual sites of violence. This meant investigators were frequently examining the final stage of the crime rather than the moment when the crime occurred. The distinction created a profound investigative disadvantage. A disposal location may reveal how a victim was abandoned, but it may reveal little about who the offender was or how the attack began. The killer's apparent awareness of this vulnerability became one of the most important observations made throughout the investigation. Whether through deliberate planning or simply fortunate circumstances, the offender benefited from conditions that reduced the availability of evidence. Victims were discovered only after significant delays. Environmental exposure damaged physical clues. The absence of identified witnesses left investigators with incomplete timelines. Each factor alone created difficulties. Combined, they produced a case that challenged even experienced investigators. Yet despite these obstacles, detectives were able to establish a clearer understanding of the offender's apparent behavior. The available evidence suggested someone who operated carefully and selectively. The victims were not chosen randomly in the sense of being taken from unpredictable public encounters. Instead, investigators believe the offender likely targeted young women who were accessible through hitchhiking or similar circumstances. This did not mean the victims were responsible for what happened to them. Their method of transportation reflected the social norms of the time, not a failure on their part. The responsibility belonged entirely to the person who chose to exploit ordinary trust for the purpose of committing violence. This distinction remains essential when examining the case decades later. Another enduring question involves whether the offender acted alone. The confirmed evidence has never provided a definitive answer. The cases contain similarities that suggest a common offender, but the investigation has never produced evidence identifying the person responsible or confirming whether others were involved. The witness account involving two men and a van in connection with Lori Lee Corse's disappearance introduced one possibility. But the information was never sufficient to establish the involvement of multiple offenders. Investigators have continued evaluating evidence carefully rather than assuming a conclusion, unsupported by facts. This caution reflects the complexity of cold case investigations, where every possibility must be considered, but every claim must also be tested against available evidence. The attention surrounding possible suspects has also shaped public understanding of the case. The mention of Ted Bundy remains one of the most recognized aspects of discussions about the Santa Rosa murders, his crimes, geographic connection to the western United States, and the similarity in victim profiles naturally led some people to consider whether he could have been involved. However, the lack of evidence connecting him to these crimes remains the central fact. A theory can remain interesting without becoming established history. For investigators and responsible researchers, the difference matters. The goal of a homicide investigation is not simply to find someone who appears capable of committing a crime. It is to identify the person responsible through evidence that can withstand examination. In this case, that standard has never been met for any suspect. The continued search for answers has also highlighted the changing role of forensic science. When the murders occurred, investigators worked without many of the tools considered essential today. DNA analysis, computerized databases, and advanced genetic techniques were unavailable. Evidence collected decades ago existed in a different investigative world. Today, preserved biological material may offer possibilities that investigators in the 1970s could never have imagined. However, modern science is only effective when usable evidence survives. Technology can analyze evidence. It cannot recreate evidence that has been lost. This reality defines many cold cases, including the Santa Rosa murders. The passage of time does not simply delay justice. It can permanently alter the information available to those seeking it. For the families of the victims, every new development carries emotional weight. Renewed investigations can bring hope, but they can also reopen painful memories. A case that remains unsolved does not remain frozen in the past. Families continue living through anniversaries, unanswered questions, and the absence of loved ones who should have shared decades of experiences with them. The public often focuses on the mystery of an unknown killer, but for the families, the central issue has always been the lives that were lost. Their loved ones were not defined by the circumstances of their deaths. They were defined by who they were before tragedy occurred. Remembering that humanity remains one of the most important responsibilities when discussing crimes of this nature. Over the years, the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders have been examined through documentaries, investigative reports, and public discussions. Each new examination brings the possibility of discovering overlooked information, but it also reinforces how much remains unknown. The case has survived because it contains both a clear pattern and a missing conclusion. The victims' disappearances, the recovery locations, and the forensic findings create a story that points toward an offender. Yet the identity of that offender remains hidden. That contradiction is what continues to draw attention from investigators and the public alike. There is enough information to understand that a serious crime occurred, but not enough evidence to explain exactly who committed it. The enduring importance of the case is not found only in the mystery itself. It also lies in the lessons it provides about vulnerability, investigation, and the importance of preserving evidence. The crimes demonstrated how easily ordinary routines could be exploited by someone with harmful intentions. They showed investigators the challenges created when crime scenes are not immediately discovered. They revealed the limitations of forensic technology during a particular historical period. Most importantly, they remind future generations that every victim in an unsolved case represents a person whose life mattered and whose story deserves to be remembered beyond the details of the investigation. More than 50 years later, the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders remain unresolved. The highways, rural roads, and isolated landscapes connected to the case continue to exist, but the events that occurred there belong to another era. The young women whose lives were taken never had the opportunity to experience the decades that followed. Their families carried the weight of loss through those years, while investigators continued searching for answers that remained just beyond reach. The identity of the killer remains unknown. The reasons behind the crimes remain uncertain. The full number of victims may never be completely established. Yet the commitment to remembering the victims and continuing the search for truth remains unchanged. An unsolved case is not the absence of justice forever. It is a promise that the search continues, even when the path has become long and difficult. And in the case of the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders, that search continues across the same landscape where the mystery first began, waiting for the evidence that may finally reveal the person who has remained hidden for more than half a century. The story of the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders remains one of the most haunting examples of an investigation where the truth appears close enough to recognize, yet distant enough to remain unreachable. More than 50 years after the first disappearance, the essential facts of the case have not changed. 7 confirmed victims have been identified. Their final journeys have been carefully reconstructed as far as the available evidence allows. Investigators have examined witness statements, physical evidence, recovery locations, and possible suspects. Generations of detectives have reviewed the files, and modern forensic science has offered new possibilities that were unimaginable when the crimes first occurred. Yet despite all these efforts, one question remains unanswered. Who is responsible? The identity of the person who ended the lives of these young women has never been officially established. The absence of that answer has transformed the case into one of the most enduring unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. But beyond the mystery, beyond the theories and investigations, the most important part of this story has always been the victims themselves. Their names are the foundation of the case. Maureen Sterling and Yvonne Weber were 12 and 13 years old when they disappeared after leaving the Redwood Empire Ice Arena. Their evening began like countless other teenage outings across California. They spent time with friends, enjoyed a familiar place, and expected to return home. Instead, their disappearance created a nightmare that would continue for decades. The discovery of their remains nearly a year later brought confirmation of the tragedy, but provided very few answers. Because so much time had passed, investigators could not determine exactly how they died or identify the person responsible. The small collection of personal items recovered from the location, an earring, orange beads, and a gold cross necklace, serve as reminders of 2 young lives interrupted far too soon. Kim Wendy Allen was 19 years old, a student at Santa Rosa Junior College who was balancing education and work. Her final moments remain one of the clearest examples of the danger hidden within the case. After leaving her job at a natural food store, she continued traveling through a system that was common at the time. She accepted transportation from strangers, as many young people did during that era, and later continued hitchhiking in an effort to return to her school. When her body was discovered, investigators recovered evidence that revealed the violence she had suffered. She had been bound, sexually assaulted, and strangled with a cord. Biological evidence was collected, but the technology necessary to identify the person responsible did not yet exist. Decades later, that evidence remains one of the most significant unanswered possibilities within the investigation. Lori Lee Corso was only 13 years old. Her disappearance occurred during a period when investigators were already struggling to understand whether multiple missing young women were connected. Lori's history of running away complicated the initial understanding of her disappearance. But her recovery eventually revealed another tragic connection to the broader pattern. Her body was found in a ravine outside Calistoga Road, and investigators determined that she had suffered a broken neck and spinal injuries. Unlike some other victims, there was no evidence of sexual assault. Her death added another layer of complexity to the investigation, showing that while certain patterns existed, the crimes were not identical in every detail. Carolyn Nadine Davis was 14 years old when she disappeared after being dropped off by her grandmother near the Garberville post office. She continued traveling along Highway 101 by hitchhiking, a method of transportation that reflected the culture of the time. Months later, her body was found near the Santa Cruz coast. The condition of her remains prevented investigators from determining the exact cause of death. Like several other victims, Carolyn's case demonstrated how time became one of the greatest obstacles standing between investigators and the truth. Teresa Walsh was 23 years old when she disappeared while attempting to travel back north from Zuma Beach. Her case provided investigators with some of the clearest evidence of the offender's methods. She was found at Mark West Creek. An examination revealed that she had been restrained in a hogtie position, sexually assaulted, and strangled. The possibility that rainfall had moved her body complicated efforts to determine the exact disposal. Location. Once again, investigators were left with evidence of a crime, but without the identity of the person who committed it. These victims were not simply names in a case file. They were individuals with families, friendships, plans, and futures that ended because of another person's actions. The passage of decades does not reduce the significance of their lives. If anything, the length of time that has passed emphasizes the importance of continuing to remember them. True crime investigations often focus heavily on the unknown offender, but the heart of any case must remain with those who suffered the greatest loss. The search for justice exists because victims mattered. The unanswered questions surrounding the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders have continued for many years. Because investigators have never found the evidence necessary to close the case. Several factors contributed to this outcome. The suspected offender appeared to understand how to minimize the possibility of detection. Victims disappeared after leaving public view. Bodies were placed in remote areas. The actual murder scenes were never located. Environmental conditions damaged evidence. The forensic technology of the period could not fully analyze what remained. Each challenge created another barrier between investigators and the answers they needed. Modern advances have provided new hope, but they have not erased the difficulties created decades earlier. DNA testing has changed the landscape of criminal investigations, allowing some cold cases to be solved after many years. However, science depends upon the survival of evidence. If crucial material was destroyed, contaminated, or never recovered, even the most advanced technology may not provide a solution. The Santa Rosa case represents both the promise and the limitations of modern forensic investigation. It shows that time can sometimes reveal answers, but can also permanently remove the evidence needed to find them. Theories surrounding possible suspects will likely continue as long as the case remains unresolved. The name of Ted Bundy will continue to appear because of the similarities people have identified between his crimes and certain aspects of the Santa Rosa murders. Yet history must maintain the distinction between possibility and proof. No evidence has confirmed that Bundy committed these crimes. No DNA, fingerprints, confession, or verified record has connected him to the murders. Other suspects have also been considered over the years, but no individual has been officially identified as the offender. The mystery remains not because investigators have ignored the case, but because the evidence has never produced a definitive answer. Perhaps the most important lesson from the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders is that every unsolved case represents a human cost. Statistics can describe the number of victims. Dates can organize the timeline. Evidence can reconstruct pieces of the investigation. But behind every fact is a person whose absence changed the lives of everyone who loved them. The families of Maureen, Yvonne, Kim, Lori, Carolyn, and Teresa have carried unanswered questions for decades. They have lived through anniversaries without the people they lost. They have waited for information that may never come. Their experience is a reminder that unresolved cases do not simply remain in police files. They continue affecting real people long after the headlines disappear. The Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders also remain a warning about how ordinary situations can become dangerous when exploited by someone with criminal intent. Hitchhiking was not unusual during the early 1970s. Many people traveled that way safely. The tragedy of this case was not that victims made unreasonable choices. The tragedy was that someone chose to take advantage of a common act of trust. Responsibility belongs entirely to the offender who committed the violence, not to the individuals who lived according to the social norms of their time. Today, the case remains open. The possibility of new evidence, new witnesses, or new forensic discoveries means that the final chapter has not necessarily been written. Investigations can change when information once considered impossible becomes accessible through new technology or renewed examination. A case that survives for decades is not necessarily a case that has been abandoned. Sometimes it is a case waiting for one final piece of evidence. More than 50 years after the first disappearance, the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders continue to stand as a symbol of unanswered questions and enduring determination. The identity of the killer remains unknown. The circumstances of some victims' final moments remain uncertain. The exact number of crimes connected to the series may never be fully established. Yet the search for truth continues because the victims deserve more than being remembered only as part of an unsolved mystery. They deserve to be remembered as people whose lives had meaning before tragedy took them away. Until the person responsible is identified, this case will remain unfinished. But unfinished does not mean forgotten. The names of the victims remain. Their stories remain. The investigation remains. And somewhere within the evidence that has survived the passage of time may still be the answer that finally brings closure to one of America's longest and most heartbreaking unsolved murder cases.